My name is Merritt Ashford, and I'm 70 years old. I'm sitting here in my garden on a warm September afternoon, watching the late-blooming roses climb the trellis I built last spring, and I can hardly believe I'm alive to see them. 3 years ago, I was certain I'd never see another spring, let alone have the strength to build anything again. But life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Even when we're convinced the story is over, sometimes we find we're only at the beginning of a new chapter. What I'm about to share with you is the story of how I learned to live again after losing everything, or at least after believing I had. It's about facing the darkest valley of despair and somehow finding a path through to the other side. It's about a illness that stripped away my identity, a friendship that arrived when I needed it most, and the slow, painful, beautiful process of discovering that healing isn't about returning to who we were, but becoming who we're meant to be. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though it's hard to pinpoint exactly when things began to fall apart. Was it the morning I woke up and couldn't remember where I'd put my car keys, only to find them in the refrigerator? Was it the afternoon I got lost driving home from the grocery store I've been going to for 35 years? Or was it earlier still, in those subtle moments when I'd lose my train of thought mid-sentence or forget the name of my neighbor's daughter, the girl I'd watched grow up? At 67, I was still working 3 days a week at the architectural firm I'd helped build from the ground up. I was proud of that. My colleagues, people 40 years younger than me, would often seek my advice on complex projects. I had a reputation for seeing solutions others missed, for understanding how a building could serve not just functional needs, but emotional ones too. Architecture, I always believed, was about creating spaces where human life could flourish. My wife, Celestine, had passed away 6 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer took her in 4 months, and I thought that grief was the worst thing I'd ever have to endure. We'd been married for 41 years. She was a pianist, and our home had always been filled with music. Chopin in the morning while she drank her coffee, Debussy in the evening while I cooked dinner. After she died, the silence in the house was deafening. But I'd adapted. That's what we do, isn't it? We adapt. I threw myself into work, spent time with my daughter Ondine and her 2 children, took up woodworking, and joined a book club. I thought I was doing well. I thought I was one of the lucky ones, healthy, active, mentally sharp. Then came the diagnosis. It was my daughter who insisted I see a doctor. Ondine had noticed things I'd been dismissing or hiding from myself. The repetitive questions, the confusion about dates and appointments, the time I couldn't remember her children's names, my own grandchildren, Quillen and Artemis, whom I'd known since birth. Early onset Alzheimer's disease, Dr. Pradesh said, her voice gentle but direct. We caught it relatively early, which means we can begin treatment right away. There are medications that can slow the progression. I remember sitting in that sterile office, looking at the diplomas on the wall without really seeing them, and feeling my entire world collapse inward like a building imploding in slow motion. I was an architect. My mind was my tool, my gift, my identity, and now it was betraying me. How long do I have? I asked, though I'm not sure what I meant. How long before I couldn't work? How long before I couldn't recognize my daughter? How long before I became a shell of myself? Every case is different, Dr. Pradesh replied, which is what doctors say when the answer's too variable or too terrible to put into words. I told Ondine after the appointment. We sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, and I watched this strong, capable woman, a litigation attorney who argued cases in front of federal judges, dissolve into tears. That might have been the worst part. Not my own fear, but seeing hers. "We'll fight this, Dad," she said, gripping my hand. There are treatments, clinical trials, research happening every day. But I could see it in her eyes. She was already grieving me, already imagining a future where I wouldn't know her, where I'd be someone she had to care for, rather than the father who'd taught her to ride a bike and helped her study for her bar exam and walked her down the aisle. I retired from the firm the following week. My partners were understanding, compassionate even, but I couldn't stand the thought of staying on and gradually becoming less competent, less reliable. I'd spent my entire career building things. I couldn't bear to watch myself deteriorate in front of people who respected me. The months that followed were the darkest of my life, darker even than losing self-esteem, because at least then I'd had my faculties, my ability to process and grieve and eventually heal. Now I was grieving myself, and the disease ensured that grief was muddy and confused and relentless. I started taking the medications Dr. Pradesh prescribed. I made charts and schedules, trying to impose order on the chaos in my mind. I carried a notebook everywhere, writing down every conversation, every task, every thought before it could slip away. I felt like I was frantically trying to hold water in my hands, watching it drain between my fingers no matter how tightly I gripped. Undine called every day. She wanted me to move in with her family, but I refused. I couldn't bear the thought of burdening them, of having my grandchildren watch me fade. Better to do it alone, I thought. Better to spare them. I stopped going to book club, stopped woodworking, stopped seeing friends. What was the point? Every social interaction was now a minefield. Would I repeat myself? Forget someone's name? Say something that made no sense? It was easier to hide, to let the world shrink down to just me and my deteriorating mind, and the silent house that still echoed with Celestine's absence. I thought about ending it. I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth. And if I'm going to tell this story honestly, I have to include the darkness. I thought about taking all my pills at once, about going to sleep and not waking up. It seemed merciful, practical even. Why prolong the inevitable? Why put Undine through years of watching me disappear? The only thing that stopped me was a strange kind of cowardice. Not fear of death exactly, but fear that this final act would be the thing Undine remembered most. That instead of holding on to memories of me as her father, she'd be left with the trauma of my suicide. So I continued, not living exactly, but existing, getting through one day and then another, without joy, without purpose, without hope. Winter came, and I barely noticed. Spring arrived, and I didn't care. I was 70 years old, and I was waiting to die. It was a Tuesday morning in late May when I first saw Tallulah Kemp. I was sitting on my back porch, staring at the overgrown garden that Celestine had once tended so carefully. The roses were wild and tangled, the herb beds choked with weeds. I'd let it all go. What did it matter? I heard someone moving in the alley behind my property, and then I saw her, a tall, thin black woman with silver hair braided into a crown around her head. She was walking slowly, carrying a plastic bag and stopping every few feet to examine something on the ground. I watched her for several minutes before my confusion turned to irritation. Was she homeless? Was she going through people's trash? Should I call someone? But then I noticed what she was collecting. Dandelions. She was picking dandelions from the alley, examining each one carefully before placing it in her bag. My irritation faded into curiosity. I stood up, my knees protesting after sitting so long, and walked toward the fence. "Can I help you?" I called out, perhaps more gruffly than I intended. She looked up, and I was struck by her face. She was probably in her mid-70s, with deep lines around her eyes and mouth that suggested a life of both laughter and hardship. But it was her eyes themselves that caught me. Dark brown and remarkably clear, with a directness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in months. "Just gathering some medicine," she said, her voice melodic, with a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "Dandelion roots, good for the liver. The leaves make a fine salad, too, if you get them young." "You're eating weeds?" I said, and immediately regretted my tone. She smiled, not offended. One person's weed is another person's medicine. These dandelions have more vitamins than most of what you'll find in a grocery store. Plus, they're free and they grow everywhere. Nature's pharmacy, right under our feet. I didn't know what to say to that. I stood there awkwardly, my hand on the fence post, aware that I'd already forgotten why I'd come over here in the first place. "You have a beautiful garden," she said, looking past me to the tangled mess of my backyard. Or it was beautiful once. Those roses, are they Cecile Brunner's? I blinked, surprised she knew roses. Yes, I think so. My wife planted them. Lovely variety, hardy. They can survive neglect better than most, but they do better with a little care. She tilted her head, studying me now instead of the garden. "I'm Tallulah, by the way. Tallulah Kemp. I just moved into the blue house 2 streets over." "Merritt," I said. "Merritt Ashford." "Well, Mr. Ashford, would you mind if I collected some of these dandelions from your alley? There's a particularly nice patch right there by your fence." I shrugged. "Take whatever you want. They're just weeds." She smiled again, that same patient smile. "Thank you. Though I maintain they're more than that." I turned to go back to the house, but she called after me. "Mr. Ashford, if you'd like, I could help you with that garden. I'm retired now. Got more time than I know what to do with, and I've always loved working with plants. No charge, just for the pleasure of it." I should have said no. I should have maintained my isolation, my determined march toward oblivion. But there was something about her, a calmness, a lack of pity in her eyes, that made me pause. "I couldn't ask you to do that," I said. "You didn't ask. I offered." She placed another dandelion in her bag. "I'll come by tomorrow morning, if that's all right, around 9. Before I could formulate an answer, she'd given me a small wave and continued down the alley, her bag of dandelions swinging at her side. I stood there for a long moment, confused and unsettled. Had I just agreed to something? I couldn't remember. I went back inside and wrote in my notebook, "Woman named Tallulah, coming tomorrow for garden." Tallulah showed up the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock, wearing canvas pants, a faded blue work shirt, and carrying a worn pair of gardening gloves. I'd almost forgotten she was coming, despite the note in my book, and answered the door in my bathrobe. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford. Ready to get our hands dirty?" I wasn't ready for anything, but I found myself nodding anyway. I changed into old clothes and met her in the backyard. For the first hour, well, I mostly watched as she moved through the garden, assessing, touching leaves, testing the soil. She talked as she worked, a steady stream of observations and questions. "These roses need pruning. When did you last fertilize? The soil's depleted. We'll need compost. Do you have a compost bin? No? We should start one. These irises are overcrowded. They need dividing. Have you noticed the aphids on the rose bushes? We can make a spray with dish soap and water." It was overwhelming. I couldn't keep track of half of what she was saying. My notebook sat on the porch railing, but I'd already forgotten it was there. "I don't know," I said finally, frustrated. "I don't know when we last fertilized or how to divide irises, or I don't know anything. My wife did all this. I just enjoyed looking at it." Tallulah straightened up, wiping her hands on her pants. She looked at me with those clear eyes, and I had the uncomfortable feeling she could see right through my excuses to the fear beneath. "That's all right," she said simply. "We'll learn together. And gardens are forgiving. You can make mistakes and they'll still grow. That's the beautiful thing about plants. They want to live. They're resilient." Something about the way she said it made my throat tighten. I turned away, pretending to examine a rosebush. We worked together for 2 hours that first day. Tallulah showed me how to deadhead the roses, cutting just above a 5-leaf stem. She explained how to pull weeds without disturbing the roots of the plants we wanted to keep. She taught me to feel the soil, to know when it needed water just by its texture. "You have to pay attention," she said. "Plants tell you what they need if you learn to listen. See this yellowing? That's nitrogen deficiency. These brown edges? Too much direct sun and not enough water. It's a language, and once you learn it, you can understand what they're asking for. I tried to pay attention. I tried to remember, but my mind felt foggy, and I kept losing track of what she just said. At one point, I asked her the same question 3 times. How deep should I dig around the iris rhizomes? And each time, she answered patiently, as if it were the first time I'd ask. If she noticed my confusion, she didn't comment on it. She just kept working, kept teaching, kept her tone easy and encouraging. When she left that morning, she said she'd come back the next day. And she did. And the day after that. Slowly, without my quite realizing it was happening, we fell into a routine. Tallulah would arrive at 9, and we'd work in the garden until 11 or noon. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes we'd work in comfortable silence. She brought seeds and cuttings from her own garden. She taught me about companion planting, how marigolds deterred pests, how basil and tomatoes thrive together. Gardens are communities, she explained one morning as we planted basil seedlings. Everything affects everything else. The plants support each other, protect each other. Some give nitrogen to the soil. Others keep the harmful insects away. It's all connected. I found myself writing things down in my notebook more regularly now. Not just reminders and schedules, but observations about the garden. Tallulah says roses like coffee grounds. Slugs hate crushed eggshells. Lavender needs sandy soil and full sun. The physical work was exhausting in a good way. My body ached at the end of each session, but it was the ache of use, of purpose. I started sleeping better, started eating more regularly because I was actually hungry from the exertion. One morning, about 3 weeks after Tallulah first appeared in my alley, I was deadheading roses when she asked, "So, what did you do before you retired, Merritt?" It was the first personal question she'd asked me. We'd talked about gardening, about the weather, about the neighborhood, but nothing deeper. I was an architect, I said. Residential and small commercial buildings mostly. Ah, she said, nodding. That explains why you noticed the structural problems in the garden. The way you were looking at that leaning fence yesterday, I could tell you were seeing the engineering failure. I hadn't realized I'd been doing that. I suppose I was. The post is rotted at the base. Needs to be replaced. You miss it? The architecture? The question caught me off guard. Did I miss it? I'd been so focused on what I'd lost, my mental sharpness, my confidence, my future, that I hadn't thought about whether I missed the work itself. I miss building things, I said slowly. I miss seeing a problem and finding an elegant solution. I miss creating spaces that made people feel, I don't know, at home, safe, comfortable. Tallulah was quiet for a moment, pruning back some overgrown lavender. You know, gardens are a kind of architecture too. You're creating spaces, solving problems, making something that serves both function and beauty. I'd never thought of it that way, but she was right. The garden was becoming a project, a puzzle to solve. Where should the new bed go to get the right amount of sun? How could we create a better flow from the patio to the lawn? What combination of plants would provide color from spring through fall? What did you do? I asked. Before you retired? I was a nurse, she said. 42 years, mostly in geriatrics and hospice care. That explained her patience, her calm demeanor. That must have been hard. Watching people die? She paused in her work, sitting back on her heels. Sometimes, but it was also a privilege. Being there at the end, helping people find peace, helping families say goodbye, that's sacred work. And you'd be surprised how many people find unexpected joy in those final days, once they accept where they are. Once they stop fighting and start being present. I thought about that as we continued working. I thought about it that night as I sat on the porch, looking at the garden that was slowly coming back to life. I thought about it the next morning when I woke up and for the first time in months, felt something that might have been anticipation. I'd love to tell you that the garden healed me, that working with Tallulah made my disease disappear. But life isn't a fairy tale, and Alzheimer's doesn't care about narratives or neat resolutions. The bad days continued. Days when I'd wake up disoriented, unable to remember where I was. Days when I'd find myself standing in a room with no idea why I'd gone there. Days when simple words would slip away, leaving me grasping uselessly at blank spaces in my mind. One morning in late June, Ondine arrived unannounced to find me in the kitchen, confused and agitated. I'd apparently been trying to make coffee, but had forgotten how the machine worked. I'd poured water directly into the filter basket, flooding the counter. "Dad," she said gently, taking the carafe from my shaking hands. "Let me help." I wanted to protest, to insist I could do it myself, but we both knew that wasn't true. I sat down at the kitchen table, defeated, while my daughter cleaned up my mess and made coffee, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I met your neighbor," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "Tallulah? She was working in your garden when I pulled up. She seems nice." "She's teaching me about plants," I said. The words felt thick in my mouth. "I can see that. The garden looks wonderful, Dad, really beautiful." She set a cup of coffee in front of me. "But I'm worried about you. You're losing weight. This house is too big for you to manage alone. Have you thought more about moving in with us?" "No," I said, more sharply than I intended. "I'm fine here." "You're not fine." Her voice cracked slightly. "You're not fine, and I can't watch you struggle like this. Please, Dad, let me help you." I looked at my daughter, this strong, accomplished woman with Celestine's eyes and my stubborn jaw, and saw the toll my illness was taking on her. The dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. For being sick? For refusing help? For not being the father she deserved? "I know," she said softly. "I know you are." Tallulah arrived at 9 as usual, and Ondine stayed to meet her properly. I watched as they talked on the porch, Tallulah explaining her plans for adding a butterfly garden in the sunny corner, Ondine nodding and asking questions, both of them occasionally glancing at me through the kitchen window. After Ondine left, Tallulah and I worked in silence for a while. Then she said, without looking at me, "Your daughter loves you very much." "I know. She's scared." "I know that too. Are you scared, Merritt?" The question should have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. Tallulah had earned the right to ask. "Terrified," I admitted. "Every day I wake up wondering what I'll lose that day. What part of myself will disappear? I'm scared of becoming someone I don't recognize. Scared of being a burden. Scared of—" I trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish. "Scared of suffering," Tallulah finished gently. "Scared of losing your dignity." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands working steadily, dividing a clump of daylilies. "When I worked in hospice, I met a lot of people facing the end. And you know what I learned? The suffering usually came from resistance, from fighting what was happening instead of accepting it. The ones who found peace weren't the ones who raged against dying. They were the ones who accepted it and asked, what can I do with the time I have? How can I still experience joy and meaning? That's different, I said. They were dying. I'm losing my mind piece by piece. That's worse. Is it? She looked at me now, her expression serious but not unkind. Merritt, you're still here. You're still you. Yes, things are changing. Yes, you'll lose things. But you haven't lost everything yet. And even when you do lose more, there will still be something left. There will still be moments of connection, of beauty, of presence. You don't understand, I said, frustrated. You're not the one forgetting. You're not the one whose brain is betraying them. She was quiet for so long, I thought I'd offended her. Then she said, my husband, Levi, had Alzheimer's. He died 8 years ago. I felt like I'd been punched. Tallulah, I didn't know. How could you? I didn't tell you. She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. He was diagnosed at 72. We had 5 years before he passed. They weren't easy years, but they weren't all terrible either. He forgot a lot of things, but he never forgot how to laugh. He never forgot that he loved our garden. In the last year, when he could barely speak, he'd sit outside for hours, just looking at the flowers. Sometimes he'd cry, and I think it was because the beauty moved him in a way words couldn't express anymore. I didn't know what to say. All this time, Tallulah had been working with me, teaching me, and she'd been carrying this knowledge, this experience with the very thing I was going through. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Would it have helped, or would you have felt like I was here out of pity?" She looked at me steadily. "I'm not here because I feel sorry for you, Merritt. I'm here because I like working in gardens, and I like your company, and maybe because I understand some of what you're going through. But mainly, I'm here because this is where I want to be." That afternoon, after Tallulah left, I sat in the garden for a long time. The roses were blooming now, not as many as when Celestine tended them, but more than they had in years. The lavender hummed with bees. The herbs we planted were thriving in their raised bed. I thought about what Tallulah had said about resistance and acceptance, about her husband sitting in his garden, moved to tears by beauty he could no longer name, about finding meaning in the time we have. I pulled out my notebook and wrote, "Still here, still me, find the beauty." July brought heat and humidity, but also tangible progress in the garden. Tallulah and I established a new routine. In the early mornings, before the sun was too intense, we'd work on the more demanding tasks, building raised beds, improving the soil, tackling major weeding projects. In the late afternoons, I'd often sit outside and do smaller tasks, deadheading flowers, watering the containers, observing. I started taking photographs, not with any artistic intention. Just simple phone pictures to help me remember. A photo of a newly opened rose with a note, "This is Cecile Brunner, planted by Celestine, blooms late spring to fall, smells like apples." A photo of the herb garden, basil, oregano, thyme, sage. Water every morning. Harvest regularly for best growth. The photos became a bridge between my failing memory and the present moment. When I couldn't remember whether I'd watered something, I could check my photo library. When I forgot what Tallulah had taught me about pruning, I could find pictures with notes. Ondine noticed the change when she visited for Sunday dinner in mid-July. I'd actually remembered she was coming and had prepared a meal, pasta with fresh herbs from the garden, a salad, bread from the bakery. "Dad," she said, looking around the kitchen and then out to the garden. This is wonderful." Tallulah helped me plan the menu, I admitted. She wrote down the recipe steps, and I set alarms to remind me to start cooking. "I don't care who helped. You did it. You're—" She paused, her eyes glistening. "You seem more like yourself." "I'm not, though," I said, needing her to understand. "I'm not better, Ondine. The disease is still progressing. I still forget things constantly. I still have bad days. But Tallulah helped me see that I don't have to wait until I'm completely gone to give up on living." After dinner, we sat in the garden, and I told her about Tallulah's husband, about what Tallulah had said about acceptance and presence. "I want to try something," I said. "I want to document this. The garden, the process, what I'm learning. Not for me. I probably won't remember it anyway. But maybe for you, or for Quillen and Artemis, or for someone else dealing with this disease. I want to show that there can still be life, still be purpose, even as things fall apart." Ondine was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think that's beautiful, Dad. I think Mom would love that you're doing this." "I think she would too," I said, and for the first time since her death, thinking about Celestine brought more warmth than pain. The next day, I asked Tallulah if she'd help me start a garden journal. Not just notes and reminders, but something more substantial. Observations about what we were doing and why. Reflections on what I was learning. "I like that idea," she said. "Gardens have always been about documenting, really. Keeping records of what worked, And what didn't? When things bloomed, what survived the winter? It's all about remembering, ironically enough. Ironically, I agreed. We started that afternoon. I bought a sturdy notebook with graph paper, easier for my increasingly shaky handwriting, and began recording not just the practical details, but also the lessons the garden was teaching me. Day 52 of working with Tallulah, I wrote. Learned that you can't rush growth. The tomatoes will ripen when they're ready, no matter how much I want fresh tomatoes for dinner. Some things just need time, and forcing them only causes damage. Maybe that's true for healing too. Day 58. Pulled out the impatiens that were struggling in too much sun. Tallulah said sometimes the kindest thing you can do is recognize when something isn't thriving and let it go. Make space for something else. I think I've been holding on to the person I was, trying to force that person to survive in conditions that no longer support him. Maybe I need to let him go and see who grows in his place. Day 63. Today was hard. Couldn't remember Tallulah's name when she arrived. Couldn't remember what we were supposed to be working on. Felt lost in my own garden. But Tallulah just gently reminded me, and we watered the plants together. And by the end, I felt anchored again. The garden doesn't judge me for forgetting. It just keeps growing. Writing helped. It gave structure to days that often felt chaotic. It gave me a sense of continuity, even when my memory failed. And on the bad days, I could read back through earlier entries and remember, briefly, the progress we'd made. In mid-August, we had 3 days of heavy rain, the kind of downpour that floods basements and knocks down tree limbs and sends gardeners scrambling to protect their plants. Tallulah and I had prepared as best we could, staking the taller plants and covering the more delicate ones. But nature is stronger than our precautions. And when the rain finally stopped, the damage was evident. The raised bed we built for tomatoes had partially collapsed, soil washing out in muddy streams. Several of the roses had lost branches. The butterfly garden Tallulah had so carefully designed was a mess of flattened stems and scattered mulch. I stood in the garden that first morning after the storm, looking at the destruction, and felt something inside me break. All that work, all that progress, gone. It's ruined, I said when Tallulah arrived. Everything we did, it's ruined. She surveyed the damage with a calm expression. It's damaged, she corrected, not ruined. There's a difference. Look at it. I gestured helplessly. The tomato bed is destroyed. The roses are broken. Everything's a mess. Yes, she agreed. It is, so we'll fix it. Why bother? The words burst out of me, carrying more than just frustration about the garden. Why bother fixing anything when it's all just going to fall apart again? What's the point? Tallulah was quiet for a moment. Then she walked over to one of the rose bushes. Despite losing a major branch, it still had several intact canes, and new buds were visible along the stems. See this, she said, pointing to the buds? This plant was here before the storm, and it'll be here after. It's damaged, yes, but it's not dead. And look, it's already preparing to bloom again. That's what living things do, Merritt. They adapt, they heal, they keep growing. I'm not a plant, I said bitterly. No, you're not. You're a human being with much more complicated feelings and fears. But the principle is the same. Damage doesn't mean death. Setbacks don't mean the end. I wanted to argue with her, to explain that it was different, that she didn't understand. But standing there in the muddy garden, looking at the resilient rosebush with its promising buds, I realized she understood perfectly. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice breaking. I'm scared that I'm the storm, Tallulah, that I'm destroying everything I've built, my relationships, my dignity, my daughter's peace of mind, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. She came over and put her hand on my arm. You're not the storm, Merritt. The disease is the storm. You're the garden, trying to survive it, and you don't have to do it alone. We spent the next week repairing the damage. It was hard work, harder than the initial building had been. And there were moments when I wanted to give up, when the physical and mental effort felt like too much. But Tallulah was patient. When I forgot what we were doing, she reminded me. When I got frustrated, she'd call for a break, and we'd sit in the shade drinking water and talking about nothing in particular. When I wanted to quit, she'd point out some small success, a repaired bed, a restaked tomato plant, a rose that was already sending out new growth from below the broken branch. "This is what recovery looks like," she said one afternoon as we worked to rebuild the tomato bed. "Not a straight line back to where you were, but a messy, imperfect process of patching things up and carrying on. It's not pretty, but it works." By the end of the week, the garden wasn't the same as it had been before the storm. The repaired bed was slightly different in shape. Some plants we couldn't save and had to remove entirely, but there was something more honest about it now, less manicured and more real. The scars of the storm were visible, but so was the evidence of survival and adaptation. I wrote in my journal, "Day 89, the garden after the storm looks different than it did before, but maybe that's okay. Maybe perfect isn't the goal. Maybe the goal is just to keep growing, to keep adapting, to keep finding beauty even in the broken places." As summer faded into autumn, I noticed changes in myself beyond just the progression of my disease. I was more patient with my limitations, more willing to ask for help, more present in the moments when my mind was clear. Tallulah and I started preparing the garden for winter. We planted bulbs that would bloom in spring, tulips, daffodils, crocuses. I knew I might not remember planting them. I might not even remember what they were when they came up, but I planted them anyway, an act of faith in a future I couldn't fully imagine. "That's what bulbs are," Tallulah said, as we tucked the last of the daffodil bulbs into the soil. "An act of hope. You plant them in the fall, in the cold and the dark, trusting that spring will come and they'll bloom. You don't see any evidence of it for months, but you trust anyway." I thought about that as I covered the bulbs with soil and mulch. Hope, trust, faith in cycles I couldn't control or fully understand. Maybe that's what I'd been missing. Not just in dealing with my disease, but in life generally, the willingness to trust that something beautiful might still emerge, even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. Undine visited more regularly now, and I noticed she was less anxious when she came. She'd bring Quillen and Artemis, and they'd help in the garden, excited to dig in the dirt and find worms and learn the names of plants. Quillen, who was 8, became fascinated with the compost bin, delighted by the idea that garbage could transform into something useful. "It's like magic, Grandpa," he said, holding up a handful of rich, dark compost that had once been vegetable scraps and dead leaves. "It is a kind of magic," I agreed. "It's called transformation, things breaking down so they can become something new." Artemis, who was 6, preferred the flowers. She'd sit for long stretches just watching the butterflies that now visited our butterfly garden regularly. Monarchs, swallowtails, painted ladies. Sometimes she'd talk to them in a soft voice, and I'd watch her from the porch, marveling at her unself-conscious wonder. One October afternoon, after the children had gone home, Tallulah and I sat on the porch watching the sunset. The garden was preparing for dormancy, perennials dying back, annuals fading, the whole landscape shifting into earth tones and quiet. "I've been thinking about your journal," Tallulah said, "about what you said, wanting to document this for others who might be going through something similar." "Yes? I think you should share it. Not the whole thing. Some of it's private and should stay that way. But the parts about what you're learning, about how the garden is teaching you to live with your diagnosis, I think that could help people." "I don't know," I said, uncomfortable with the idea. Who would want to read the confused ramblings of a man losing his mind? First of all, they're not confused ramblings. They're honest, thoughtful observations. Second, you'd be surprised how many people are looking for exactly what you're offering. proof that life can still have meaning even in the midst of loss. Permission to find joy even while grieving. I thought about it over the next few days. The idea made me uncomfortable, exposing my vulnerability to strangers. But I also remembered what Tallulah had said about her husband, about the privilege of being present during difficult times. Maybe sharing my experience was a way to be present for others, to offer something useful even as I lost so much. With Ondine's help, I started a simple blog. She set it up and showed me how to post, and I promised to keep it updated as long as I was able. The first post was brief. My name is Merritt Ashford. I'm 68 years old, and I have early-onset Alzheimer's disease. This blog is about learning to live, really live, not just exist, with a degenerative condition. It's about finding purpose when your future is uncertain. It's about what my garden is teaching me about growth, decay, resilience, and transformation. I don't know how long I'll be able to keep writing, but I'll share what I can while I can. I didn't expect anyone to read it, but within a week, I'd received dozens of messages. People with Alzheimer's or other degenerative diseases, family members caring for loved ones, people dealing with chronic illness, depression, grief. They thanked me for my honesty. They shared their own stories. They told me I'd given them hope. It was overwhelming and humbling. I printed out some of the messages and kept them in my journal, reading them on days when I felt discouraged. One message in particular stayed with me. It was from a woman named Cora whose father had Alzheimer's. Thank you for showing that my father is still in there, still capable of growth and learning and joy. I'd started thinking of him as already gone, but your blog reminded me to see him as he is now, not mourn him as he was before. You've given me my father back. I cried when I read that, sitting at my kitchen table with the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Not tears of sadness exactly, but something more complex. Grief and gratitude and connection, all mixed together. By November, the garden was mostly dormant. We'd cut back the perennials, protected the roses, put the delicate potted plants in the garage. The raised beds were covered with mulch, waiting for spring. I'd expected winter to feel like an ending, like a metaphor for my own decline. But Tallulah, it was something different. Look, she said one cold morning, kneeling by the base of a rose bush. She brushed away some mulch to reveal green growth at the base. Even now, in the cold, it's preparing. The roots are still active underground. Energy is being stored. It looks dead, but it's not. It's resting, gathering strength for spring. But what if spring doesn't come? I asked. For me, I mean. What if I don't make it to see these plants bloom again? Tallulah stood up, meeting my eyes. Then someone else will. Your daughter, your grandchildren, maybe even strangers who read your blog and come to see the garden. The beauty you've created doesn't stop existing just because you're not here to see it. That's supposed to be comforting, isn't it? Knowing that your work continues, that you've planted seeds, literally and figuratively, that will keep growing? I thought about the bulbs we'd planted, sleeping under the frozen ground. About the people reading my blog who told me it was changing how they approach their own struggles. About Quillen and Artemis, who now understood that things could be broken and still beautiful. That growth was a cycle, not a straight line. Maybe Tallulah was right. Maybe the comfort wasn't in personally witnessing every outcome, but in knowing you'd set things in motion that would outlast you. My bad days increased as winter set in. The cold seemed to make my confusion worse, or perhaps it was just the natural progression of the disease. There were mornings when I didn't recognize my own house, afternoons when I couldn't remember if I'd eaten lunch, evenings when Ondine would call and I'd struggle to follow the conversation. Dr. Pradesh adjusted my medications, but we both knew we were just buying time. The disease was doing what diseases do, progressing despite our best efforts to slow it. But the strange thing was, I wasn't as terrified anymore. The fear was still there, but it didn't consume me the way it once had. I'd found something to hold on to, Not false hope that I'd be cured, but genuine acceptance that I could still have moments of beauty and connection, even as I declined. On Thanksgiving, Undine hosted dinner, and Tallulah joined us. It was a small gathering, just my daughter's family, Tallulah, and me. At one point, I lost track of the conversation entirely, retreating into a confused fog while everyone talked around me. I felt Artemis's small hand slip into mine under the table. I looked down at her, and she smiled up at me, not with pity or fear, but with simple affection. "I'm thankful for you, Grandpa," she whispered, "and for our garden." Something about that. The way she said "our garden," including me in the present tense, not speaking about me as if I were already gone, pierced through the fog. I squeezed her hand, grateful beyond words. Later that evening, after everyone else had gone home, Undine and I sat in her living room. She'd lit a fire, and we watched the flames in comfortable silence. "You seem different, Dad," she said eventually. "Not better. I know the disease is progressing, but more at peace, maybe." "Tallulah taught me something," I said, searching for the right words. "She taught me that I can't stop the disease, but I can choose how I meet it. I can resist and rage and make myself and everyone around me miserable. Or I can accept it and ask, what can I still do? How can I still experience joy? How can I still be of use?" "And you found answers to those questions?" "Some days. The garden gives me purpose. The blog lets me feel like I'm contributing something. You and the kids remind me I'm still connected, still loved. It's not the life I planned, but it's still a life. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Undine said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Dad. So proud of how you're handling this." "I couldn't do it without help," I said. "Without you, without Tallulah, without the garden itself. But thank you. That means more than you know." December brought snow and ice and short, dark days. It also brought a significant decline in my condition. The change was rapid and frightening. I'd have moments of clarity followed by hours of confusion. I'd find myself in rooms with no memory of how I'd gotten there. I'd call Undine by Celestine's name, then realize my mistake and see the pain in my daughter's eyes. The blog posts became shorter, less frequent. Some days I'd sit at the computer with no idea what I was supposed to be doing. Other days I'd write something only to read it back and realize it made no sense. Tallulah continued to visit, but we couldn't work in the frozen garden. Instead, we'd sit inside and plan for spring. She'd bring seed catalogs, and we'd mark pages, dreaming about what we'd plant when the ground thawed. "Do you think I'll be here for spring?" I asked her one gray afternoon. "I think you're here now," she said. "That's all any of us have, now. I don't know what spring will bring any more than you do. But I know we're planting these gardens anyway, because that's what hopeful people do." In mid-January, I fell on the ice in my driveway. I wasn't seriously hurt, just bruised and shaken, but it was the catalyst Undine needed to insist, finally, that I couldn't live alone anymore. "Please, Dad," she said at the hospital, where they checked me over, "please move in with us. I can't do this anymore. The constant worry, the phone calls to check if you're okay, the fear that I'll show up and find you've hurt yourself. Please." I looked at her exhausted face and knew I couldn't keep refusing. It wasn't fair to her. It wasn't fair to any of us. "Okay," I said. "Okay, I'll move in with you." The relief in her expression was profound and heartbreaking. Telling Tallulah was harder than I expected. We were sitting in my kitchen, boxes already starting to pile up as Undine helped me pack, and I couldn't find the words. "I'm moving in with Undine," I said finally. I can't take care of myself anymore." "I know," Tallulah said gently. "I've known for a while that it was coming." "What about the garden?" Even as I said it, I knew how foolish it sounded. The garden was the least of my concerns. "The garden will be here," she said. "I'll keep tending it, if that's all right with you and your daughter. The bulbs we planted will bloom in spring. The perennials will come back. The garden will keep growing, Merritt. But I won't see it, I said, and finally allowed myself to grieve what I was losing. You might, Tallulah said. Ondine's house isn't far. We can visit. And even if you can't physically be here, you've seen it already. You've put your work into it. You've left your mark. That doesn't go away. We sat in silence for a while. Then Tallulah said, "Do you remember what I told you about my husband? About how at the end, he couldn't speak, but he'd sit in the garden and be moved by the beauty?" I remember. He taught me something in those final years. He taught me that there are many ways to be present. Even when words fail, even when memory fails, we can still experience joy, still feel love, still be connected to beauty. You're not gone yet, Merritt. You're changing, yes, but you're not gone. I moved into Ondine's house in late January. She'd prepared a room for me on the ground floor. My furniture from home, familiar pictures on the walls, my journal and laptop on the desk by the window. The transition was hard. I felt displaced, confused, sometimes angry. I'd wake up disoriented, not knowing where I was. I'd wander the house at night, searching for something I couldn't name. I'd have outbursts of frustration that scared my grandchildren and broke my daughter's heart. But slowly, with patience and routine and love, I adjusted. Quillen and Artemis became my anchors. They'd check on me after school, telling me about their days. Artemis would draw pictures for me, usually of gardens and butterflies, and tape them to my walls. Quillen would read to me from his books, not minding when I lost track of the story. Tallulah visited twice a week, and we'd look at pictures of the garden on her phone. She'd tell me what was happening. The bulbs were starting to push through the soil. The roses were budding out. The birds were returning. "It's almost spring," she'd say. "The garden is waking up." March arrived with warming temperatures and longer days. Tallulah came to Ondine's house one morning with an unusual request. "I want to take you to the garden," she said. "It's time." Ondine was hesitant, worried about me being overwhelmed or confused, but Tallulah was insistent. "He needs to see this," she said. "Trust me." So on a bright Saturday morning, Ondine drove us to my old house. The current owners, a young couple who bought it from Ondine, had agreed to let us visit the garden. When we walked into the backyard, I stopped and stared. It was transformed. Not just alive, but radiant. The bulbs Tallulah and I had planted were blooming in wild profusion. Daffodils and tulips and crocuses in yellows and purples and whites. The roses were covered in new growth, tight buds promising color to come. The butterfly garden was already attracting early spring pollinators. But more than that, the garden had been expanded. The young couple had added new beds, built an arbor, planted what looked like fruit trees. They'd taken what Tallulah and I had started and built on it, made it their own. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "It's more beautiful than I imagined." "That's what happens when you plant good things," Tallulah said. "They keep growing. Other people add to them. They become more than you ever dreamed." We spent an hour in that garden. I couldn't remember all the names of the plants, couldn't recall exactly what I'd done there, but I could feel it, the rightness of it, the sense that I'd been part of something that mattered. Artemis and Quillen ran through the paths, exclaiming over every bloom. Ondine took pictures, documenting not just the garden, but my face as I experienced it, the wonder, the peace, the bittersweet joy. At one point, I found myself standing by the rose bushes, the Cecile Brunners that Celestine had planted decades ago. They were covered in buds, almost ready to bloom. "I remember these," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure if I was talking about the roses themselves or the memory of planting them with my wife, or both. "They remember you too," Tallulah said softly. "You took care of them. You brought them back to life when they were dying. That's not nothing, Merritt. That matters." On the drive home, I was quiet, processing what I'd seen. When we got to Ondine's house, I went directly to my room and opened my journal. My handwriting was shakier now, but I can still write. Day 287. Visited the garden today. The bulbs bloomed. Everything we planted came back. The garden is more beautiful than I remember. Or maybe I'm seeing it clearly for the first time. Tallulah was right. The beauty doesn't stop existing just because I'm not there to tend it. It grows, it transforms, it continues. I think that's the lesson I've been learning all along. Not how to hold on to what I'm losing, but how to let go with grace. How to trust that the things I've planted, in gardens, in relationships, in the world, will keep growing even after I'm gone. How to find peace in impermanence. I'm still scared. I still grieve what I'm losing. But I'm also grateful. Grateful for the time I had with Celestine. Grateful for Ondine and the grandchildren. Grateful for Tallulah and her patient teaching. Grateful for the garden and everything it taught me. This disease is taking so much from me, but it hasn't taken everything. I can still love. I can still experience beauty. I can still matter to the people around me. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough. Spring deepened into early summer. My condition continued to decline. More bad days than good. More confusion than clarity. But there were still moments of presence, of connection, of unexpected joy. The blog had taken on a life of its own. Ondine managed it now, posting updates based on our conversations. The community that had formed around it was remarkable. Hundreds of people sharing their own stories of loss and resilience, offering support to one another, finding hope in the shared struggle. One post in particular seemed to resonate. Ondine had written it based on a conversation we'd had one evening when I was having a rare moment of lucidity. My father said something today that I think captures his journey. He said, "I thought I was dying when I got my diagnosis, but I was wrong. I was actually being planted, like those bulbs we put in the ground. It felt like an ending, like being buried, but it was actually the beginning of something new. I had to break down, had to lose parts of myself, so that something different could grow. I'm not who I was, but I'm still growing, still blooming in my own way." The responses to that post were overwhelming. People talked about it bringing them to tears, about it changing how they viewed their own struggles, about it giving them permission to find growth even in grief. "You're helping people, Dad," Ondine told me. "Even now, even as you're losing so much, you're still giving so much." In June, Tallulah organized a garden party at my old house. The young couple who owned it now were happy to host, and they invited everyone from the neighborhood. Tallulah had reached out to people from my blog too, and several who lived nearby came to meet me. It was overwhelming in the best way. The garden was at peak bloom, roses cascading over arbors, the butterfly garden alive with color and motion, herbs releasing their fragrance in the warm air. Children ran through the paths, adults gathered in small groups, talking and laughing. Someone had set up a table with lemonade and cookies. I sat in a chair in the shade, Artemis on one side of me and a woman named Ruth on the other. Ruth's mother had Alzheimer's, and she'd been following my blog for months. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for sharing your journey. It's helped me see my mother differently, not as a tragedy, but as someone still living, still capable of joy." I wanted to say something profound, something worthy of her gratitude, but the words wouldn't come. So I just squeezed her hand, and she seemed to understand. Quillen brought me a butterfly that had landed on his finger, a monarch, its orange wings brilliant in the sunlight. "Look, Grandpa," he said softly, holding very still so the butterfly wouldn't fly away. "It came to our garden, the garden you made." "Our garden," I corrected gently. "We made it together." The butterfly stayed for a moment longer, then lifted off, dancing away into the afternoon. We watched it go, and I thought about transformation, about how caterpillars have to completely dissolve, have to break down into something unrecognizable before they can become butterflies, about how that dissolution isn't death, it's metamorphosis, maybe that's what was happening to me. Not dying, but transforming into something different. Something I couldn't fully understand yet, but something that was still part of the same continuous life. I won't pretend that the rest was easy or beautiful in a conventional sense. The summer and fall brought more decline. I stopped being able to write in my journal. Then I stopped recognizing the journal at all. I forgot Tallulah's name, though I still smiled when she visited. I called Ondine by her mother's name more often than her own. But Ondine says, and I have to trust her memory now, since mine is mostly gone, that there were still good moments, times when I'd laugh at something Quillen said, afternoons when I'd sit in Ondine's garden watching the birds, seemingly at peace, evenings when I'd listen to Celestine's old piano recordings and my eyes would fill with tears. Not of sadness, she thinks, but of some deep recognition of beauty. The blog continued, with Ondine posting updates. She shared the hard parts honestly, the frustration, the grief, the exhaustion of caregiving. But she also shared the unexpected gifts, my sudden moments of clarity, the way I'd sometimes speak in metaphors that were surprisingly profound, the love that persisted even when memory didn't. One post from late September, almost 2 years after I'd moved in with her. Dad mostly doesn't speak anymore, but this morning, we were sitting in the garden and a monarch butterfly landed on his hand. He looked at it for a long time, and then he said clear as day, "Flying to Mexico, long journey, worth it." Then he went quiet again. I don't know if he was talking about the butterfly's migration or something else, but it felt important, like a reminder that even difficult journeys can be worth taking. In October, Tallulah brought bulbs, hundreds of them, and helped Quillen and Artemis plant them in Ondine's garden. I watched from my wheelchair, unable to help but somehow participating in the ritual. "These are for you, Grandpa," Artemis said, patting the soil over the last bulb. "For spring." I don't remember saying anything in response, but Ondine says I smiled, and my eyes were clear, and I squeezed Artemis's hand. Winter came. I grew weaker, more confused, more distant. But Ondine says I was never agitated, never seemed distressed. I'd entered what she called a different country, somewhere beyond language and memory, but not, she believed, beyond feeling. On a cold February morning, Tallulah visited and sat by my bed. She held my hand and talked to me about the garden, about spring coming, about the bulbs waiting underground. "You taught me something too, you know," she said. "I thought I understood resilience from caring for my husband, from all my years as a nurse. But you taught me about grace, about facing loss without bitterness, about planting gardens even when you know you might not see them bloom. Thank you, Merritt." I don't remember that conversation, but Ondine says I squeezed Tallulah's hand, and a single tear rolled down my cheek, and she believes I understood. I died 2 weeks later, peacefully, in my sleep. It was a gray March morning, cold but with a hint of warmth that promised spring was coming. The bulbs bloomed that spring, just as they were meant to. Daffodils and tulips and crocuses covering Ondine's garden in color. The children tended them carefully, and Tallulah helped them understand that this was part of the cycle. Death and life intertwined, each making the other possible. The blog continued for a while, with Ondine posting a final entry. "My father died yesterday morning. He was 70 years old, and he had Alzheimer's disease for 3 years." Those facts don't capture the fullness of who he was or what he taught us. He was a man who faced his worst fear, losing his mind, with remarkable grace. He could have retreated into bitterness and isolation. Instead, he learned to garden, to write, to share his journey with strangers who became friends. He showed us that life can still hold meaning, even in loss, that we can still grow, even as we're dying, that planting gardens is always worthwhile, even if we never see them bloom. The gardens he created, literal and metaphorical, continue. The physical garden at his old house thrives under new care. The garden at my house blooms with the bulbs he watched us plant. And the garden of connection he cultivated through this blog continues to grow as people share his story and support one another. Thank you to everyone who followed this journey, who shared your own stories, who helped my father feel less alone. You gave him purpose in his final years, and you gave our family a community of support. That's its own kind of garden, seeds of kindness and connection that will keep blooming long after we're gone. In my father's journal, one of the last entries he was able to write says this: "I am not the person I was, but I am still here, still growing, still reaching toward the light. That is enough. That is everything." I think he was right. It was enough. It was everything. So here I am, sitting in my garden on this warm September afternoon, 3 years after that diagnosis that felt like a death sentence. Except, I'm not really here, am I? Not in the way I was at the beginning of this story. The me who's writing this, or rather, the me that Ondine is writing about, is mostly gone. But something remains. Not memory exactly, but impression. Not thought, but feeling. Not the person I was, but something that grew from who I was. If I could speak to you now, you who might be facing your own diagnosis, your own devastating loss, your own dark valley, here's what I would want you to know. The fear you're feeling is real and valid. The grief for who you were and what you're losing deserves to be honored. Don't let anyone tell you to be positive or look on the bright side or find the silver lining. Sit with your grief. Let it move through you. But also know this: you are not your diagnosis. You are not your loss. You are a person in the midst of change. And change, while painful, is not the same as ending. Find your garden. I don't mean this literally, though literal gardens are wonderful teachers. I mean find the thing that grounds you in the present moment, that gives you purpose, that connects you to something larger than yourself. For me, it was gardening and writing. For you, it might be painting or cooking or volunteering or spending time with animals or learning a new language or teaching someone a skill you have. The specific activity matters less than the act of engaging with life, of continuing to grow, even as parts of you are dying. Accept help. I resisted this for so long, viewing it as weakness or burden. But allowing people to help you is actually a gift to them. It lets them feel useful, lets them express their love in concrete ways, lets them be part of your journey instead of helpless witnesses to your decline. Document your experience if you can. Not for posterity or legacy, those are nice, but not the point. Document because it helps you make sense of what's happening, because it creates a bridge between your present and past selves, because it might help someone else feel less alone, because bearing witness to your own life, even the hard parts, is a form of honoring it. Look for teachers in unexpected places. Tallulah came into my life as a stranger picking dandelions in an alley. She stayed as a friend who understood both gardening and grief, who knew how to be present without pity, who taught me that damage and death are not the same thing. Your teacher might be a therapist, a support group, a book, a stranger who becomes a friend. Stay open to wisdom wherever it appears. Plant bulbs. Again, I mean this literally and metaphorically. Do things whose benefits you might not personally witness. Write letters to be opened after you're gone. Start projects you might not finish. Teach children skills they'll use when you're no longer here to see it. Create beauty that will outlast you. This isn't about denial of your situation. It's about affirming that life continues, that your contributions matter, even if you don't see their full flowering. Be kind to the people who love you. They're scared too. They're grieving too. They're doing their best in an impossible situation. Your disease is happening to them as well as to you, in different but still painful ways. When you can, acknowledge their struggle. Thank them for their care. Tell them you love them while the words still come easily. Find moments of beauty and hold them gently. A sunrise, a child's laugh, music that moods you, a perfectly ripe peach, the way light falls through leaves. These moments don't erase the hard ones, but they exist alongside them, and they matter just as much, maybe more. Remember that healing doesn't always mean cure. Sometimes healing means accepting what is. Sometimes it means finding peace amid chaos. Sometimes it means discovering that you can be both broken and whole, both dying and fully alive. Most importantly, know that your life still has value, not in spite of your diagnosis, but including it. This journey you're on, as hard as it is making you into someone new. Not better or worse than who you were, but different. And that person, that evolving, adapting, resilient self, has lessons to teach and love to give and beauty to create. The garden taught me that death is not the opposite of life, but a part of it. Leaves fall, plants die back, flowers fade, but it's all part of a cycle, all necessary for new growth. I am dying, yes, but I'm also still living. And in this season between those states, I found more meaning, more connection, more purpose than I thought possible. So plant your gardens, friends. Tend them as long as you can. Trust that they'll keep growing even when you can't be there to see them. And know that the act of planting itself, the hope it represents, the care it requires, the beauty it creates is worth everything. The bulbs are in the ground. Spring will come. New life will bloom from what seemed like endings. That is my story. That is my lesson. That is what remains. This story was written at the request of someone caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's disease. It was shared widely in the patient community and sparked conversations about dignity, purpose, and finding beauty in difficult seasons. The gardens Merritt created continue to bloom. The lessons he learned continue to teach. The seeds he planted continue to grow. May we all have the courage to plant gardens, even in winter. May we all find teachers when we need them. May we all remember that transformation, while painful, is not the same as ending. And may we all bloom in our season, whatever form that blooming takes.